Facebook. Hey, it exists. We all know that. And in today's world where it seems everyone is increasingly tied into social media, well, will Facebook ever have an impact, or has it ever had an impact on jury trials? Well, that takes us to this week's case. This week's case involves a real case, took place in Nashville, Tennessee. And there, unfortunately, there was a woman who was found murdered. Her roommate was indicted for the murder. His name was Smith. And case went forward, went to trial, and at trial, there was a pathologist who testified. The doctor's name was Dr. Lewis, and Dr. Lewis testified that the woman died from 2 gunshot wounds. One was to the chest, and one was to the back of the head. The woman would have survived the gunshot wound to the chest, but could not have survived the gunshot wound to the back of the head. The doctor went on to state that based upon the nature of the penetration by the bullet in the head and the absence of powder burns, that it was a gunshot that probably took place from an intermediate distance. In short, it was not suicide, but in fact was a murder. Well, shortly after the doctor testified, the case went to the jury, and the doctor, Dr. Lewis, advised the judge in an email that he had received a Facebook communication from one of the jurors who happened to know the doctor. And the juror wrote, "Hey, terrific job, really did a fine job, really appreciated what you did. This is all really wonderful." The doctor advised the judge of that and said, "Hey, you know, this took place. I want you to know that there was a non-sanctioned, a non-agreed to communication from a juror to me." Judge called all the various defense attorneys and the prosecuting attorney together and said, "Here's what we've got, guys. There clearly was an interaction between the juror and the witness. What do you want to do about this?" Well, everyone agreed at that time that it appeared to be an innocuous interaction, a mere interaction, and that really nothing further needed to be done. Or at least so the judge believed, and he then went forward. The jury came back, found the person guilty, and the judge wound up sentencing Mr. Smith to life in prison. Well, needless to say, he did not want to spend life in prison, and he appealed that through his attorneys, and on appeal it was argued that the judge should have done more with respect to that communication from a juror to a witness. And what the judge needed to do, what they argued, was to have a full hearing, find out exactly what was said and what impact that had on the specific juror and on the jury as a whole. Nobody knew really what happened other than the communication took place. Now, it's entirely possible that that specific juror went into the deliberation room and said, "Hey, you know, I know Dr. Lewis. Matter of fact, I wrote Dr. Lewis after this on the Facebook, and gee whiz, the doctor is terrific. You know, that's someone you really need to believe." And that kind of conversation may have been very persuasive with the jury. So the question was whether or not the judge should have had a full-scale hearing, or whether, in fact, it should have just been allowed to go forward. In this instance, as I say, the judge allowed the case to go forward. It went on the actual appeal, as I say. It was argued that there should have been a full-scale hearing. And the case found its way all the way up to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And up there, the court heard these two arguments. On behalf of the prosecutor, it was said, hey, this was basically an innocuous, a mere interaction, wasn't going to have a big impact on the trial. On behalf of the defense, it was argued, we don't know. We don't know whether it had a big impact on the trial. For all we know, that communication was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how that juror was behaving, and that that juror was being very persuasive in finding a verdict of guilt based upon the relationship with Dr. Lewis. So we needed to have a full-scale hearing, and that didn't take place. Therefore, we're asking at this point in time at the Supreme Court, the Tennessee Supreme Court, for a new trial. Well, the court heard these arguments and came away making a simple observation, and that is that social media is all over the place and many people participate in it, and also made the observation that just because there was a communication from a juror to one of the witnesses does not mean that in any way that juror was tainted or in any way that juror tainted the deliberations. But they pointed out, and again, this was a capital offense, this was a murder. The person was sentenced to life in prison. They said in this situation, there should have been a full-blown hearing. And what the judge should have done was gotten everybody together, gotten both Dr. Lewis there, gotten the juror who'd communicated with Dr. Lewis there, gotten the actual communication itself, and then in addition found out what impact that had on the juror itself and engaged in a hearing in which all that information could have come forward, and then the judge needed to make a determination as to what the facts were and make a conclusion of law finding as to what law applied. Without that kind of evidentiary inquiry by the judge, the Supreme Court said, we don't know what happened, and therefore we have to send this back to the trial court for that kind of inquiry. And if it's found that it can't be done because people have gone away, people are no longer available or whatever else, then we're going to grant a new trial. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this? Well, what we learn from this case is a very simple thing, and that is jurors are not supposed to be talking with people who testify at trial. They're not supposed to be communicating with them via Facebook or in any other manner. And if that does take place, the court has an obligation to find out exactly what took place and determine whether what took place had an impact upon the jury itself. Remember, in a jury trial, it's the jury that makes the determination. The jury is not to consider things that come to it outside of evidence that was presented in the courtroom. And when you suddenly have a juror that's starting to communicate with a witness, the question always arises, is that juror getting more information than the other jurors, and is that information that that juror is getting information that would not have been allowed at trial? For these reasons, jurors can't communicate and should not communicate with witnesses, and for these reasons, as we've just seen, when it does happen, a court needs to conduct a full hearing to determine what took place. Okay, we bring in this case as we bring in cases every week so you understand how the law works. I'm David Allen.